$3. The clerk said it twice, once for her and once for the room, the way a man does when he wants the whole county to remember later that he warned her. Hannah Merrick counted the coins onto the counter anyway. $2 silver and a handful of small change she had been saving in a tobacco tin since the spring of 1885. The tin had her husband's name scratched into the lid. She did not look at it when she set it down. There is no water on that quarter. The clerk pushed his spectacles up with one knuckle. Deems dug it twice. Old Purdy dug it before him, 40 feet of dust both times. You are buying dirt and rattlesnakes, missus, then it is cheap at $3. Behind her, near the door, a girl of 7 stood on one foot with the other tucked up behind her knee, watching every coin come out of the tin. Cora Braddock had a smear of flour on her sleeve from the morning bread and a piece of string tied twice around her wrist that she would not explain to anybody. She had not been asked to come to town. She had climbed into the wagon before daylight, settled herself in the box among the feed sacks, and refused, in complete silence, to be sent back to the house. Hannah signed her name in the register. The clerk blotted it and looked at her over his spectacles a long moment, the way people had been looking at her for 11 months. As though a woman with no husband and no money and no people had blown in off the weather and might blow back out again if a man did not keep an eye on her. Cora took her hand on the boardwalk outside. She did not say anything about it. She simply took it and held on and matched her short steps to Hannah's all the way down to the wagon. The land sat 6 miles southwest of the Braddock place, in a fold of ground the county called the Hollow because it was too shallow to be a canyon and too low to be a flat. Buffalo grass, soapweed, a wallow the herds had ground out before anybody living could remember. One cottonwood standing crooked at the low end, with half its crown dead. Everybody who had ever looked at it agreed on the same thing. Good grass, no water, no use. Deems had owned it 4 years and dug his hole on the high shoulder near the road, because that was where a man would want a house. He got 40 feet down through hardpan and gave it up and told the story in town for 2 winters afterward. He sold it to the county for taxes, and the county could not give it away. That was how it came to be sitting in the book at $3, and how a hired housekeeper with a tobacco tin came to be the only person in Ellis County who had ever wanted it. Hannah had come out to Kansas in the fall of 1886 with one trunk and a folded advertisement from a Missouri paper. Wanted, a steady woman to keep house and cook for a man and 1 child. Wages $3 the month and board. Braddock, Ellis County. She had answered it the week after her husband's brother took the farm. There had been no argument about it. There had been nothing to argue with. The deed had her husband's name on it, and her husband was 2 years under the sod behind the church, and his brother had a wife and 4 boys and a legal opinion from town, and Hannah had a trunk. She wrote the letter that night by lamp and mailed it in the morning before she could think better of it. Eli Braddock met her at the depot in Hayes. He was 38 years old, tall, weather burned across the nose and cheekbones, with a hat he took off when she stepped down and did not put back on until she was in the wagon. He looked at her hands before he looked at her face. She understood that. Out here a man read hands the way a banker read a ledger. You can cook. I can cook. He put her trunk in the wagon and drove her 22 miles without saying more than 4 sentences, and 3 of those were about the road. The Braddock place was 1,100 acres of the best grass she had ever seen, and not one honest drop of water on it. The well by the house had turned in the summer of 1884. It still gave, but it gave gyp water, bitter and white, and it soured milk and loosened bowels and killed anything you tried to grow in it. 2 years running, Eli had hauled water 4 miles from the Saline in barrels, morning and evening, 360 days a year, for a house and a garden and 40 head that stood at the fence looking at him. His wife had been dead 2 years that November. Mary Braddock. Nobody said her name in the house. Her Sunday coat still hung on the second peg by the door, and her cook stove was still the best thing in the kitchen, and her daughter had gone 9 days without speaking a word to the woman who had come to take over her mother's stove. Eli paid on the first of the month. He put the coins on the corner of the table where she would find them, and he never once put them into her hand. Hannah put every one of them into the tobacco tin, and every night she wrote the number down on the back of the advertisement. And by the November of 1887 she had $31, and a plan she had not told a living soul about. Winter was the making of them, though none of the three would have said so at the time. It came early and hard that year. The stove ran from 4 in the morning until 9 at night, and the house smelled of coffee and wood smoke and wet wool, and Hannah learned the shape of the days. She learned that Eli got up in the dark and came in at noon with his hands cracked open across the knuckles and would not use the salve she left out until she stopped mentioning it. She learned that Cora would not eat eggs, but would eat anything with an egg hidden in it. She learned that the child talked to the horses in full sentences and to grown people in nods. Then, one evening in December, Hannah came in from the shed and found the table set for supper with 3 places, and at her place was the blue plate. There were 4 blue plates in the house, and they lived on the high shelf, and they had come out from Ohio wrapped in a wedding quilt. In 11 weeks they had been down exactly twice, both times on a Sunday, and both times Eli had washed them himself and put them back up without a word to anybody. Cora was standing at the end of the table, with her chin about level with the edge of it, arranging the knife so it lay straight. Hannah did not make a speech about it. She hung up her shawl and washed her hands and sat down in front of the blue plate and ate her supper off it like it was tin. Eli looked at that plate for a long moment. He looked at his daughter. Then he reached for the bread and said something about the north fence needing wire in the spring, and that was all that was ever said about it in words. After that it came steady, the way water comes into a footprint. Cora began saving her the chair with the arm on it, the good one nearest the stove, by sitting in it herself until Hannah came in, and then getting out of it and standing there until Hannah sat down. She began leaving things on the windowsill over the wash bench. A bird egg, blown clean. A flat stone with a shell pressed into it, a hawk feather laid out straight as a pen. And she began following, out to the hen house, out to the wood ricks, out along the north draw, where Hannah walked most mornings before the light came up strong. Cora never asked where they were going. She only got her coat and stood by the door. In January, the wind came out of the north for 9 days without a break, and they lived in the kitchen because it was the only room the stove could hold. Hannah taught her to work a lump of dough with the heel of her hand. Cora taught Hannah the names of the 4 horses and which one bit and which one leaned. They mended a shirt of Eli's between them, one at each shoulder, and Cora put her stitches in so small and so slow that it took her an hour to go 2 inches, and Hannah let her, and did not do it over afterward when the child was asleep. One night the wind woke the girl, and Hannah heard her feet on the boards. She came and stood at the side of the bed in the dark, not asking, not crying, just standing there in her nightgown with her arms down at her sides. Hannah moved over and turned back the quilt. Cora got in and went to sleep in about the time it takes to count 60, with her forehead against Hannah's shoulder and one fist closed on the sleeve of her nightdress. In the morning Eli was at the stove before either of them, which he had never once been, building the fire up so the room would be warm when the child came out of that room. He did not look around when Hannah came in. He filled the coffee pot and set it on and went out to the barn in the dark, and the fire he had laid burned all morning. the string on her wrist she wore every day. When she thought nobody was watching, she untied it and dropped one end down the rain barrel with a nail knotted onto it, and pulled it up and looked at the wet mark and tied it back on. Hannah saw her do it a dozen times that winter and never once asked. Some things a child will tell you when she is ready, and never if you go after them. 1888 came in dry and stayed dry. By the middle of June, there had been 1 inch of rain since the thaw, and the grass had gone the color of a dog's back. The saline dropped until the barrels came up half sand. Men in town started talking about Colorado the way men in trouble always talk about somewhere else. Hannah's father had been a well digger in Missouri, in a county of limestone and hidden creeks where every farm had its own quarrel with the ground. From the age of 6, she had walked out with him on other men's land, and he had never once used a forked stick, and he had made a living for 40 years. Water lies where water lay, he told her. Find the old channel. The ground forgets nothing. He taught her what to look at, where the frost goes off first in March and where it hangs on, where the dew sits an hour later in the morning, where the buffalo grass stays green 3 weeks past everything around it. Cottonwood and willow do not grow where they please. They grow where they can, and one crooked cottonwood standing alone in a country with no trees is not an accident. It is a signature. Ants will not build on wet ground. Deer will not walk 100 yards out of their way for nothing. And the low end. Always the low end, where a man never wants to put his house. The 3rd week of June, Hannah walked out at 4 in the morning into the north draw on the Braddock place, in a summer when the grass on both sides of that draw was dead, and she found a strip of green about the width of a wagon running 80 steps along the bottom, and a place where the ants stopped. She went back for a spade. She dug a hole the size of a wash tub, 3 feet down, and by noon there was a slow brown seep standing in the bottom of it. And by evening there was clear water, and enough of it to matter. Eli came up on the draw at sundown with the sorrel and found his housekeeper standing in a mud hole to her ankles with her sleeves rolled and her hair come down, and 40 head of thirsty cattle strung out behind her along the fence, and his daughter sitting up on the bank with the water bucket between her knees, filthy to the elbows and grinning like a fool. He got down off the horse. He walked the length of the seep and back. He crouched and put his hand flat in the water and held it there. Where did you learn this? My father dug wells. He stayed crouched a while longer. When he stood up, his face had not changed at all, but that night at supper he moved the lamp. For 11 months it had sat at his end of the table. He carried it down and set it by her plate so the light fell on her side, and he ate his meal mostly in the dark, and he did not remark on it, and neither did she. The seep saved 11 calves that summer, and word of it was in town inside of a week, because hired men talk. That was where the trouble started, and the trouble came riding out on a good bay horse in the 1st week of August, wearing a town coat in 90 degrees. Deems had a long jaw and a way of laughing before he got to the end of a sentence. He sat his horse in the Braddock yard and told Hannah he had heard the funniest thing at the land office, and then he told it back to her with the parts he liked best, and he laughed at the $3 and at the clerk's face, and at the notion of the hollow being worth anything to anybody. Then he stopped laughing and offered her $5 for it. She said no. He came back 11 days later and offered 25, and when she said no again, he explained to her, kindly, the way a man explains a thing to a woman he has decided is a fool, that the sale had been irregular, that a tax parcel could not lawfully be conveyed to a person who was not a resident householder of the county, that he had spoken to a lawyer in Russell about it, and that she would save herself considerable embarrassment by taking the $25 now. Hannah asked him one question. She asked where he had put his hole. Up on the shoulder by the road, where a house would go, he told her, like it was the only place on God's earth a hole could be put. She thanked him for coming. That night, at the table, she told them, "I am going out to the hollow in the spring. I will take the little wagon and what is mine, and I will build there." Eli set his cup down. "There is no water on that quarter Hannah Deems dug 40 feet. Purdy dug before him. They dug on the high ground. A hole is a hole. A hole is not a hole." She said it flat and even, and she did not look away from him. Anybody can put a hole in the ground. The trick is where. He did not answer her. He got up and went out to the barn and stayed there past 10 o'clock, and she heard him moving harness that did not need moving. The talk got to town ahead of her, the way it does. By the middle of September, there were 2 versions of Hannah Merrick in Ellis County. In one of them, she was a woman who had saved a man's calves in a dry summer with nothing but a spade and a good eye. In the other, she was a widow who had gotten herself hired into a widower's house and had a piece of ground of her own inside a year, and people who told it that way always got quiet when she came into the mercantile. She heard it once through a shelf of dry goods, 2 women and a name and a small mean laugh, and she stood there with a paper of needles in her hand until they had moved on to somebody else. Then she paid for her needles and went out to the wagon where Cora was waiting on the seat and drove home and did not mention it at supper. Eli heard it too. He came back from the sale barn in October with his jaw set and did not eat, and he was out at the woodpile splitting until well after dark on a night when there was already wood enough stacked to last until March. In the morning, her coat was gone. Not missing. Gone the way a thing goes when a 7-year-old has thought about it for a long time. Hannah looked for 2 days without saying a word and found it at last rolled up inside the flour barrel in the shed. In the barrel they would not open again until the new sacks came in the spring. At the bottom, under everything, where a woman could not leave in the winter without going to some trouble to get her coat back, she took it out and shook the flour off it and hung it back on the peg. On the second peg, beside Mary Braddock's Sunday coat. Then she sat down on the wash bench and put her face in her hands for a minute and a half, which was longer than she had let herself do any such thing in 3 years. She dug the well in March, on Sundays. She started the day the frost came out, at the low end of the hollow, 40 steps from the crooked cottonwood, in a swale where the buffalo wallow held a ring of grass that had stayed green into November. She had walked it 11 times since August. She had put a spade in it in 4 places and smelled the dirt off the blade, and in one of those places the dirt smelled like a cellar. Cora came every Sunday. There was no discussion about it. She was in the wagon before Hannah got to it, sitting on the bucket with the string on her wrist. They rigged a windlass out of a wagon axle and 2 forked posts. Hannah dug and filled, and Cora cranked the bucket up and dumped it on the spoil pile, and when the bucket got too heavy for her, she braced her boots against the post and hauled with her whole body, 7 years old and 8.5 stone of nothing, and never once asked to quit. 6 feet on the first Sunday. Dry sandy loam, easy going. 9 feet on the second. The dirt changed to a gray clay that came out in slabs and smelled of nothing at all, and Hannah went home that evening and lay awake a long time. The third Sunday was the 25th of March, and it was the day Deems came out with the county surveyor. They came at noon, 2 men on horses and a buggy behind, and they stood at the rim of the hole where a woman was standing in it up to her shoulders, and Deems started in about the lawyer and Russell and the residency clause and the $25, which had come down to $15 now that he had gone to expense over it. At 11 feet the clay had turned to a coarse gray sand. At 11 feet and a half the sand was wet. Hannah did not tell them. She stood in that hole with mud to her knees and let the man talk over the top of her head, and she put her spade down through the wet sand and leaned on it, and it went in like it was going into a bank of snow. It came up at 12 feet. It came up around her boots first, cold enough to burn, and then it came up faster than she could throw it out, up over her ankles, up her shins, gray with sand and then clearing, and Hannah Merrick stood at the bottom of a hole she had paid $3 for and watched the water come into it and could not make herself move. Cora had gone flat on her stomach at the rim, hanging her head and shoulders down over the edge. Then she got up. She walked around the spoil pile to where the two men were standing with their hats in their hands, and she stopped in front of Deems, and she said the first words any grown stranger had heard out of her in 2 years. "You dug on the shoulder." "My mother dug in the swale." Deems looked down at her the way a man looks at a dog that has spoken to him. Cora did not move. She pointed at the hole, and then she pointed at the crooked cottonwood, and then she put her hand flat on her own chest. "This is our land. She is my mother. We live here now." The surveyor took his hat all the way off then. He walked to the rim and looked down at the water rising in the hole, and he looked at it a good while, and then he took a pencil out of his coat and wrote something in his book. And he told Deems, in a voice that carried, that the parcel had been conveyed by the county under the standard form, that he had witnessed the register himself, and that there was not one thing irregular about it in the state of Kansas. Deems got on his horse. He said the water would be gyp inside a month. It never was. 22 years later, it was still the sweetest water in that end of the county, and men hauled from it in the dry summers, and Hannah Merrick never charged one of them a cent for it except one. Eli was in the yard when they came in that evening, and he read it off the two of them before the wagon stopped. His daughter had mud to her hair and a face on her he had not seen since her mother was alive. He did not say congratulations. He did not say a word about it at all. What he did was this. On Monday, he hitched the team at 4 in the morning and drove to Hayes and came back at dark with a load of cutstone off the railroad and 4 wagon lengths of cottonwood plank, and he unloaded it at the hollow, not at his own place. On Tuesday, he went to the courthouse and paid the recording fee out of his own pocket and had the deed entered in the book in her name, Hannah Merrick, Soul. And he brought her the paper folded in a flour sack and put it on the corner of the table where he used to put her wages, and went out. On Wednesday he curbed the well in stone with his own hands, kneeling in the mud from first light to dark, and Hannah brought him his dinner out, and he ate it standing up and went back to work. On Thursday he brought the surveyor back out at his own expense and had a water lease drawn, 1 page, plain language. Eli Braddock to run 40 head to water at the hollow well, the water and the ground remaining hers entire, payment of $3 the month, in coin, on the 1st. The 1st of April he put 3 silver dollars in her hand, not on the corner of the table, in her hand, and he closed her fingers over them with his own and held on about 2 seconds longer than the business required. On the 15th, he brought out Mary Braddock's cook stove in the big wagon with Cora's bed roped on behind it, and he stood in the doorway of a house that had 2 walls and no roof, and he took his hat off. I have got no talent for saying things. I have noticed that. He turned the hat around in his hands 1 full turn. If I was to build the rest of this house, he stopped there and started over. If I was to build it, I would want to be building it for the 3 of us. I have not got a better way to put it than that. Hannah looked at him a moment. Then she picked up the near end of a cottonwood plank and stood there, holding it, waiting. He picked up the far end. They were married in June by the Methodist minister in Hayes with the surveyor standing up for them, and Cora carried the flowers, and the string came off her wrist that morning for the first time in 2 years. She had cut it, she told Hannah at last, off the rope of her mother's bucket at the old sweet well, the one that had gone bitter in '84. She had kept it to measure with. She had been dropping a nail on the end of it down every hole and cistern and barrel on the place since she was 5 years old, looking for the thing that had gone out of that house when her mother died. It measured 12 feet. Hannah tied it around the handle of the new bucket, and it stayed there. The rain came back in the fall of 1888, the way it always does, about a year too late to matter. By then there was a house at the low end of the hollow with a roof of split cottonwood and a stone curbed well 12 steps from the kitchen door. In the mortar of that curb, on the south side where the sun struck it in the afternoon, there were 3 handprints pressed in while it was still green. A man's, wide across the palm and cracked at the knuckles. A woman's, with a spade blister showing plain. And between them a small one, fingers spread as far as they would go. Cora planted a cottonwood switch beside the well that spring, cut from the crooked tree at the top of the swale, and it took, the way they do where there is water. She was out at the well the last evening of the year, cranking the windlass with the string swinging on the handle, hauling up a full bucket in the cold. Behind her the kitchen window was yellow, and the smoke went straight up in the still air, and her father came down the path from the barn to take the weight of it off her, and did not need to be asked.